Hey there, and welcome to Dark Creaky TV. If you're new, hit that subscribe button for spine-tingling Reddit creepypasta stories that are perfect for a night of chilling thrills. Don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and let's get into tonight's stories. We asked the Ouija board who it was. The answer appeared in the mirror. So this whole thing started out as a joke. You know how it is. Bored on a Friday night, nothing to do. So you start browsing the weird corners of the internet. My buddy Matt had this obsession with conspiracy theories and the deep web. The dude always found the sketchiest, creepiest stuff online. I'm talking forums where people discuss paranormal sightings, weird encrypted messages, and all sorts of other nonsense. Honestly, most of it was just so ridiculous that it was hard to take seriously. But that night, something changed. We weren't just looking for weird content, we wanted to create it. Matt, along with my other friends, Jen and Derek, came over, and we ended up talking about how everything online is either fake or staged for clicks. If people are going to believe that dumb YouTube ghost footage, imagine what they'd think if we recorded ourselves doing something like a Ouija board session, Jen said, laughing as she scrolled through videos of fake haunted houses. I laughed along with them, but deep down, I felt uneasy. See, I've never been a fan of Ouija boards. There's something about opening a door you can't close that doesn't sit right with me, you know. But Matt, of course, had a plan. He always had a plan. You guys want to do it? I have a board in my basement, Matt said, way too casually for my liking. Of course you do, Derek smirked. He was the skeptic of the group, never believing in anything supernatural. If it wasn't scientifically explainable, it didn't exist to him. I figured he'd be the perfect balance for my nerves. Let's live stream it, Jen said, her eyes lighting up with excitement. She had a small YouTube channel, mostly vlogs and random challenges, but this would be something new. We'll make it look super real, like those urban legend videos. People eat that stuff up. I don't know why I agreed. Maybe it was peer pressure, or maybe it was the beers we'd had earlier, but I found myself nodding along like this was just some harmless fun. Besides, if something did happen, we'd all be in it together. Safety in numbers, right? So, we set up the Ouija board in Matt's dimly lit basement. It was one of those stereotypical settings: creaky stairs, exposed pipes, and a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. Matt had even thrown some candles around for atmosphere. Jen set up her phone on a tripod, adjusting the lighting to make everything look extra spooky. All right, we're live in 3. 2 1-inch Jen announced, the excitement practically bubbling over in her voice. We gathered around the board, sitting cross-legged on the cold concrete floor. The planchette sat in the middle, ready to move. Even though I knew this was just for fun, my stomach twisted into knots. There's something about staring at that board, knowing how many stories you've heard, that just, I don't know, messes with your head. Matt took the lead, because of course, he did. Is there anyone here with us? He asked, loud and dramatic for the camera. For the first few minutes, nothing happened. Honestly, I was relieved. I figured we'd mess around for a bit, laugh about how nothing supernatural ever happens, and then call it a night. But then, the planchette moved. I know what you're thinking. Come on, it was probably one of your friends pushing it. And believe me, I thought the same thing. But I was watching their hands closely. Everyone swore they weren't doing anything, and their fingers looked so light on the planchette, like they were barely touching it. And when it moved, slowly, but with purpose, there was this weird weight in the air. Like suddenly, the room got colder. The planchette spelled out Hello. All right, who's messing around? I asked, trying to sound casual, but my voice came out more shaky than I wanted. Jen raised her hands in mock innocence. Not me, I'm just filming. Matt looked serious though, too serious for his usual laid-back attitude. Okay, let's keep going. Who are we talking to? His voice had this edge to it, like he was actually nervous now. The planchette didn't move for a few seconds. Just when I thought maybe the joke was over, it slid across the board again. Goodbye. That wasn't what any of us expected. Derek rolled his eyes. Well, that was anticlimactic. Guess the ghost is camera shy. But Matt, for the first time that night, looked uncomfortable. Wait, no, that's not right. I've messed around with Ouija boards before. They never just say goodbye right off the bat. It's like dismissing us before we even get to talk. That's when Jen noticed something in the reflection of the basement window. She squinted, her face going pale as she slowly stood up and pointed. Guys? What's that? We all turned toward the small, grimy window that led out to the yard. It was barely big enough to see through, but you could definitely make out our reflections in the dim light. Except there was something else. Someone, or something, was behind us. The weird part, when we all turned around to look behind us, there was no one there. Nothing, just empty space. But when we turned back to the window, that shadowy figure was still standing there. We all stood there, frozen, staring at the window like it was some kind of trick mirror. There was something in that reflection. I swear to you, it wasn't just one of us casting a weird shadow. This thing, it looked human, but off. You know that feeling when you see a mannequin, and for a second, your brain tries to convince you it's alive. It was kinda like that, except way worse because it was moving. Not much, just barely shifting behind us, like it was waiting for something. I don't know how long we all stood there, just watching it. Jen was the first one to break the silence. You guys see that, right? Please tell me you see that. I see it, I mumbled, barely able to get the words out. Derek, ever the skeptic, stepped closer to the window. It's probably just a shadow from outside. Chill out. He leaned in, squinting, trying to make sense of what he was looking at. His nose practically touched the glass. But that's when the figure moved. Fast. It darted across the reflection like a flicker, disappearing from one side of the window and reappearing in another. Except, again, there was nothing behind us. I watched Derek's face go from smug to completely white in about 2 seconds. His bravado melted away, and for the first time that night, he looked genuinely freaked out. Okay, what the hell was that? Derek stammered, stepping back like the window might bite him. Matt, ever the curious one, crouched down by the board. His eyes darted between us and the planchette, like he was trying to decide whether this was all just some elaborate prank. It's got to be a trick, he muttered, almost trying to convince himself. Like, maybe it's the candles or... Just then, every candle we had set up in the room blew out, all at once. The basement plunged into darkness, except for the pale light from Jen's phone, which was still recording. There was this brief second where no one moved or breathed, and the only sound was the low hum of the basement's old, rattling heater. Then, the smell hit us. This awful, sharp stench, like burning hair and something metallic. It was so strong I gagged and had to cover my nose. What the hell is that smell? Jen coughed, waving her hand in front of her face. It's sulfur, Matt said quietly, standing up slowly from the board. Jen snapped her head towards him. Sulfur? Are you serious? Like demon stuff? I don't know, he said, a lot less cocky than he had been a few minutes ago. I've just heard, stories. It's probably just the candles burning out. That's all. But even he didn't believe it. We could all tell. Derek reached for the light switch, fumbling in the dark, but nothing happened when he flipped it on. The bulb overhead didn't even flicker. Great. Perfect. Power's out. Just fantastic, he muttered sarcastically. But I could hear the edge of panic in his voice. Maybe we should just leave, I suggested, already halfway to the stairs. I'm serious, guys. This doesn't feel right. It's not worth it. Jen grabbed her phone off the tripod, her hands shaking. Yeah, screw this. I'm not sticking around to find out what that thing is. We all started to head for the stairs when we heard it. The sound was faint at first, almost like a soft whisper, but it was coming from everywhere at once. At first, I thought it was wind or maybe the pipes groaning. But no, it was a voice. Low, raspy, and slow, like it was struggling to form words. I see you. We all froze. The voice was unmistakable now, and it wasn't coming from the window or some random direction in the room. It was coming from the Ouija board. I am here. The voice rasped again, louder this time. Jen dropped her phone in shock, the screen cracking as it hit the floor, but none of us even cared. We were locked in place, staring at the board. The planchette was moving on its own, scraping slowly across the letters. Matt, what did you do? I whispered. But he was just as frozen as the rest of us. His eyes were glued to the board as the planchette slowly spelled out something that made my stomach twist. M-I-R-R-O-R. Mirror, Jen breathed. What the? Then we heard the creak, the soft, subtle sound of something shifting in the dark, right behind us. We turned toward the window, and that's when I saw it. The reflection in the glass had changed. The shadowy figure wasn't behind us anymore. It was in front of us. In the reflection, we could all see it standing in the middle of the room, right between us, even though there was nothing physically there. The figure was clearer now, still blurry around the edges, but unmistakably humanoid. Its head tilted slowly, almost curious, like it was watching us. Its eyes, well, if they were eyes, were just dark, empty voids staring back at us. I couldn't breathe. None of us could. Then, without warning, the figure in the reflection lifted its hand, long, bony, and covered in what looked like wet, rotting skin, and pointed directly at me. At that moment, the basement door at the top of the stairs slammed shut with a deafening bang. Jen screamed. Derek bolted for the door, but when he pulled on it, it wouldn't budge. "It's locked! It's locked from the outside!" he shouted, his voice rising in panic. Matt scrambled for his phone, shaking as he dialed. "I'm calling 911. This is messed up. We need to get out of here." But before he could even press call, the phone went dead. Every light on it just shut off, like the battery had been drained in an instant. Jen's phone too. Everything electronic just stopped working. Then the voice came again. This time it was louder, closer. "I am with you." The reflection in the window shifted once more, and I swear to God, the figure smiled. We stood there, paralyzed, staring at the twisted smile on that thing's reflection. It wasn't even like a real smile, more like someone who didn't understand how to be human was trying to mimic one. The corners of its mouth stretched too far, almost tearing at the skin, but there was no real joy in it, just malice. Derek was still yanking at the door, his shoulder slamming into it over and over. "Open! Open! Open!" His voice was rising, cracking with panic. Jen was hyperventilating, clutching at her chest, trying to catch her breath. Her phone was still dead on the floor, the screen cracked in a spiderweb pattern. Matt hadn't moved an inch since the figure pointed at me. His face was pale, and I could see his fingers trembling at his sides. "I am with you," the voice echoed again, this time sounding even closer. It was no longer coming from the board, no longer distant or disembodied. It was like it was right in the room, breathing down our necks. I did the one thing that I knew I shouldn't have done. I turned around. There was nothing there, just the cold basement, the shadows from the extinguished candles, the pile of dusty boxes in the corner. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, something invisible, standing just out of reach, waiting for us to make the next move. "Don't turn your back on it," Matt whispered, finally snapping out of his trance. "Don't turn your back on it." "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice hoarse. But before he could explain, Jen started sobbing. "We have to get out of here. We have to leave. I don't care if we break the window. I'm not staying in this place with whatever this is," she cried, stumbling toward the window, desperate. Derek abandoned the door and grabbed an old wrench from one of Matt's shelves. swinging it at the small basement window with all his strength. The glass shattered into 100 tiny shards, but when we looked through the hole, there was nothing outside. No trees, no backyard, no sky. It was just blackness, like the window was a void that led to nowhere. "What the?" Derek breathed, backing away from the shattered glass, shaking his head in disbelief. No, that's not possible. There should be light. There should be light, Jen finished, her voice barely a whisper. We all knew what should have been outside, the backyard, the fence, the streetlight from the alley. But instead, it was like we had been transported into some other version of the basement, one that was cut off from the real world. That's when the voice came again. "You can't leave." I could hear it. We could all hear it. But this time, it wasn't just a whisper. It was like it was pressing against our skulls, speaking directly into our minds. There was this strange pressure building, like the air itself was getting heavier with each word it spoke. Matt started pacing, muttering to himself. "This isn't right. This isn't right. I didn't ask for this. It's not supposed to happen like this." I grabbed him by the shoulders. "What do you mean, it's not supposed to happen like this? What the hell did you think was going to happen?" "I don't know, man," he snapped, his eyes wild. "I just thought it'd be a stupid game. I didn't think we'd actually..." He stopped himself, his mouth hanging open like he'd said too much. "Actually what?" I pressed, but before he could answer, there was a thud from upstairs. We all went quiet. The thud came again, louder this time. Someone was walking around on the floor above us. Slow, deliberate footsteps. The kind that you hear late at night when you're alone, and you know you shouldn't be hearing them. "Matt," Jen whispered, backing toward the stairs. "Who's upstairs? Who else is in the house?" Matt shook his head, his voice trembling. "No one. It's just us. No one else is home." Another thud. Closer now. It was heading toward the basement door. Derek gripped the wrench tighter, his eyes locked on the door. "I don't know what's going on, but whatever's up there is coming down here." We waited, breath held, as the footsteps stopped just outside the door. There was this agonizing silence, like everything in the world had frozen. Then, the doorknob slowly started to turn. I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a metal pipe, and braced myself. Derek stood beside me, wrench in hand, while Jen and Matt stayed back, trembling in the darkness. The doorknob creaked, turning ever so slowly, like whoever or whatever was on the other side was savoring the moment. And then, the door creaked open, but no one was there. I swear, I've never felt anything like the fear that hit me right then. It was like a tidal wave of dread crashing over me. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst right out of my chest. I don't see anything," Derek whispered, his voice shaky. That's when the basement lights flickered back on. The single bulb overhead buzzed to life, casting harsh shadows across the room. We all jumped, startled by the sudden change. For a moment, the basement looked normal again, like maybe this was all some horrible prank or dream. But then I saw it, in the mirror hanging on the wall by the stairs. There, in the reflection, was the figure again. It wasn't in the middle of the room anymore. It was standing right behind me. Before I could even scream, I felt something cold brush the back of my neck, ice cold, like a freezing breath. The hair on my arms stood on end, and every instinct in my body screamed to run, but I couldn't move. I couldn't even turn around. I was frozen in place, staring at my reflection, watching that thing reach out toward me. Its hand hovered just above my shoulder, its fingers long and twisted, the nails jagged and blackened. It leaned in closer, its face inches from mine, but in the mirror its features were still blurred, like I couldn't fully comprehend what it looked like. Then, it whispered in my ear, "I'm behind you." I couldn't move. It was like my body had locked up, frozen by some invisible force. My brain was screaming at me to run, to do something, but all I could do was stare into the mirror, my breath catching in my throat. The figure behind me wasn't just a shadow anymore. It was clearer now, solid, but still wrong, like its form didn't belong in this world. Its skin was stretched too tight over its bones, the angles of its face too sharp, its eyes two black pits where nothing lived. And the worst part, it was grinning. That same twisted, unnatural smile, as if it was enjoying the fear coursing through me. "I'm behind you," the whisper came again, this time clearer, more deliberate. The breath against my neck was cold, so cold it burned. I wanted to turn, to see if it was really there, but I couldn't. I just couldn't. Suddenly, Derek grabbed my arm, snapping me out of my paralysis. He yanked me backward, away from the mirror. The second I broke free, the feeling lifted, and I could move again, gasping as if I'd just been held underwater. "What the hell was that?" Derek yelled, his voice panicked, but trying to stay controlled. He was trying to keep it together, but I could see it in his eyes. He was just as scared as I was. I didn't even answer him. I couldn't. My heart was racing, and my legs felt like they could give out any second. All I knew was that I wanted to get as far away from that mirror as possible. I glanced back at it once more, just to see if it was still there. It was gone. The figure vanished, like it had never been there at all. Jen was sobbing quietly, her back pressed against the wall, her eyes wide and unfocused. "It's not real," she kept repeating under her breath. "It's not real. It's not real." Matt was still by the Ouija board, staring down at it like it had betrayed him. Like maybe, if he looked hard enough, he'd find an answer. He shook his head, his voice cracking as he spoke. "This wasn't supposed to happen. I've done this before. I've used these stupid boards. Nothing like this has ever happened. We were just supposed to get some footage for the video, that's all. This wasn't supposed to be real." I wanted to scream at him, to ask him why he even thought playing with something like this was a good idea. But before I could say anything, the door at the top of the stairs slammed shut again. The sound echoed through the basement, loud and final, like a coffin lid closing. We all jumped, staring at the door as the heavy footsteps resumed upstairs. They were louder now, faster, like whatever was up there was pacing, circling us like a predator waiting for its prey to make a wrong move. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice shaking. "We need to break down the door. Something. We can't stay in here." Derek nodded, stepping toward the stairs, still gripping the wrench like it was his lifeline. "If we all hit it at once, maybe we can bust it open. If not, we can try the basement window again." Matt, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly stood up, his face pale and his eyes wide. Wait, no, we can't leave yet." I stared at him like he'd lost his mind. "What are you talking about? We have to leave, Matt. You heard that thing. You saw it. We need to get out before it—" "No!" Matt shouted, cutting me off. His hands were trembling as he gestured wildly toward the Ouija board. "If we don't close the session, it'll follow us. It'll never stop. That's the rule. You can't just leave. You have to say goodbye. You have to close it. If we don't, it'll stay with us." I looked at the board, the planchette still sitting in the middle, like some kind of cursed artifact. My skin crawled at the thought of touching it again. I didn't know what was worse, staying in this basement with whatever was stalking us, or risking taking it with us out into the world. Jen whimpered, hugging her knees to her chest. "Matt, I don't care about the stupid rules. We need to go." But Matt was adamant. "Number, you don't understand. This thing, it's not just going to go away. We have to finish what we started, or it'll be with us, always. Do you want to wake up in the middle of the night and see that thing standing at the foot of your bed? Do you want it in your house, in your life?" He had a point, even if I didn't want to admit it. As much as I wanted to run, there was this gnawing dread in my stomach that told me Matt was right. If we left without closing that door, it would follow us. And maybe that's exactly what it wanted. The footsteps upstairs stopped again, this time right above the basement door. The air grew thicker, colder. Whatever was up there wasn't just waiting anymore. It was listening, watching. "Fine," I said, swallowing the lump in my throat. "We'll close the session, but we need to do it fast, and we need to get out of here right after." Matt nodded, kneeling back down by the board. "Everyone, put your hands on the planchette." Jen and Derek hesitated, but eventually, we all crouched down beside him, our fingers resting lightly on the planchette. I could feel Jen shaking beside me, her breath coming in short gasps. I wasn't much better. My hands felt like they were made of ice, and my stomach churned with every second that passed. Matt took a deep breath. "We're closing the session now," he said, his voice wavering. "We're saying goodbye. You're not welcome here anymore." The planchette didn't move. "Come on," Matt urged. "Say goodbye." The planchette remained still, and that's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The mirror. The reflection was back. That thing, the figure, was standing behind us again, but this time it wasn't just watching. It was leaning down, close, its hands hovering over our heads like it was toying with us, deciding which one of us to claim first. Its grin was wider now, more pronounced, and its eyes, they weren't just empty voids anymore. They were hungry. Suddenly, the planchette jerked under our fingers, moving with a speed and force that none of us could have caused. It shot across the board, spelling out 3 words, over and over. No, more, time. And then the lights went out. The darkness swallowed the room whole, thicker than before, like a blanket of pure black had been thrown over us. The air itself felt suffocating, pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. I couldn't see anything, just the sound of Jen's panicked breathing, Matt's ragged gasps, and Derek muttering under his breath, "This isn't happening. This isn't happening." But it was happening. The last thing I saw before the lights went out was that figure hovering over us in the mirror, its grin stretching impossibly wide, like it knew exactly what was coming next. There was a pause, this horrible, deafening silence that stretched on forever, like the world was holding its breath. And then, we heard it. A sound. Not from upstairs this time. It was in the basement with us. A low, wet scraping noise, like something dragging itself across the cold concrete floor. I tried to pinpoint where it was coming from, but it was everywhere, echoing off the walls, circling us. "Everyone stay still," Matt whispered, though his voice was shaking just as badly as mine. "Don't move." But staying still was impossible. My body was trembling uncontrollably, every nerve screaming at me to run, to get out of there before whatever was crawling through the dark found us. The scraping grew louder, closer, the sound thick and sludgy like something heavy and wet was being dragged through the room. My mind raced with 1,000 horrible images of what could be down there with us. I didn't want to know what it looked like. I didn't want to see it. And then it stopped. Right next to me. I could feel it. This horrible crawling sensation on the back of my neck, like something was inches away from my skin, something cold and wrong. The air around me felt heavier, like it was bending under the weight of whatever was lurking in the dark. I wanted to scream, but I was too afraid of what might happen if I made a sound. Then Jen broke. She let out a choked sob, scrambling backward, her hands slapping the floor as she tried to crawl away from whatever was near us. I can't do this. I need to get out. I need to..." Before any of us could stop her, she was on her feet, running blindly toward the stairs. "Jen, wait!" Matt yelled, but it was too late. The second she made it to the bottom of the stairs, the basement door slammed open on its own, and we heard her scream. It wasn't the kind of scream you hear in movies or haunted houses. It was this raw, primal sound, like all the fear and panic in her body was ripping its way out of her throat. She didn't even make it halfway up the stairs before she fell silent. The rest of us just froze, listening, waiting for anything, some sign that Jen was still there. But all we got was the silence, stretching out like a black hole, ready to swallow the rest of us whole. "Jen!" Derek called out, his voice small and terrified. He took a step toward the stairs, but before he could get any closer, the door slammed shut again, shaking the whole room. I heard Matt whispering under his breath, "No, no, no, this isn't right. This isn't happening." He was shaking, his hands hovering over the Ouija board like it was his last lifeline. I watched as the planchette moved again, but this time it was jerking violently, faster than before. It spelled out one word: "Leave!" Matt shot up, his eyes wide and wild. "We're not supposed to leave without closing it. We'll be trapped. It'll follow us. We don't have a choice," I yelled. My heart was pounding so hard, it felt like it was going to explode. "We need to go, now." Derek didn't need any more convincing. He grabbed me by the arm, dragging me toward the stairs. Matt stumbled after us, still muttering about how we couldn't leave without saying goodbye. But at that point, I didn't care about the rules anymore. If we stayed, we were going to end up like Jen, silent, gone, taken. Derek threw himself against the basement door, slamming his shoulder into it until it finally gave way, creaking open. For a split second, I thought we were free. I thought maybe we could make it out of that house alive. But then I looked up, and there it was. Standing at the top of the stairs, in the dim light from the hallway, was the figure. It was taller now, more defined. Its body was hunched and twisted, its long arms hanging low, almost scraping the floor. Its skin, if you could call it that, was mottled and dark, like it had been rotting for centuries. But the worst part was its face. That grin. It was wider than ever, stretching impossibly across its face, and those hollow, hungry eyes were locked onto us. We backed down the stairs instinctively, our backs hitting the cold concrete as the thing took a step forward. Its movement was slow, deliberate, like it was savouring the fear radiating off of us. With every step it took, the lights flickered above us, casting long, shifting shadows across the room. Matt was the first to snap. "We have to finish it. We have to close it," he screamed, diving toward the board again, grabbing the planchette. "Everyone now! Say goodbye. Say it." Without thinking, we all threw our hands onto the planchette, desperate, terrified. "Goodbye!" we shouted in unison, our voices cracking under the weight of the fear. The planchette jerked violently under our hands, like something was fighting us for control. It slid to G, then O, then stopped. The figure took another step forward, its long, gnarled hand reaching out toward us. "Goodbye!" Matt screamed again, forcing the planchette toward the B. It dragged across the board, slowly but surely, toward the letters, each movement making my stomach twist with dread. The creature reached the bottom of the stairs. The planchette hit the final E, and the second it did, the lights above us exploded, showering us with glass. We all screamed, throwing our arms over our heads, ducking as the shards rained down. And then, silence. Complete, deafening silence. The air changed, the pressure lifted. I opened my eyes, my heart pounding in my ears, expecting to see the figure looming over us, ready to take its final step. But there was nothing. The basement was empty. The door at the top of the stairs was open, the hallway beyond it clear and normal. The oppressive darkness was gone, replaced by the soft hum of the house's regular noises. We were alone. Matt, Derek and I just sat there for what felt like forever, not daring to move, not daring to speak. Finally, Derek stood up, his legs shaky. "Is it over?" Matt didn't answer. He just stared down at the board, his eyes glazed over. "We closed it," he whispered. "It's over." But as we climbed the stairs, as we finally left that basement behind, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, that maybe it wasn't over. That's when I glanced back, just once, into the hallway mirror, and in that brief second, I saw it again. that twisted grin, staring back at me from the reflection. And I swear, I heard the whisper again. I'm still with you. We played with a Ouija board at 3 a.m. Now we're haunted by what we awakened. All right, before I dive into this, let me just say this. I was never the kind of person who believed in paranormal stuff. Ghosts, spirits, demons. It was all just Halloween decorations and horror movie plotlines to me. But that changed. Fast. It all started about 2 months ago, during one of those late-night hangouts with my friends that usually involved bad decisions and way too much caffeine. You know the type. It's 2 a.m., everyone's sleep-deprived but still wired from energy drinks, scrolling aimlessly on their phones or watching random YouTube conspiracy videos. Anyway, that night, we were over at my buddy Zach's place, just the usual crew. Me, Zach, Jess, and Chris. We've been friends since middle school and honestly, we've always gotten into dumb stuff. But what happened that night? It's on a whole other level. We were bored out of our minds, right? And we're sitting in Zach's dimly lit basement. You know, classic horror setup. Zach randomly pulls out this dusty old Ouija board from his closet, acting all nonchalant like, "Hey, let's try this out." Jess immediately was like, "Nah, that's how horror movies start." But, like, we're idiots, so obviously we ignored her. Chris, the most skeptical of all of us, laughed it off and said, "It's a piece of cardboard, guys. What's the worst that could happen?" Now, let me pause here for a second. Looking back, I should have listened to Jess, but at the time, it seemed like a joke, something to pass the time. Zach's basement had this weird vibe already. Old, creaky wood, a single flickering light bulb overhead, and the kind of silence that makes you feel like someone's watching you, even when you know you're alone. It was perfect for what was about to go down. So we set up the board on this rickety coffee table in the middle of the basement. The room felt colder the second we put the planchette in the center of the board. At first, we're just laughing and making fun of it. Like, "Ooh, spirits, come talk to us." You know, typical stupid teenage banter. Jess stayed quiet, but reluctantly joined in, placing her fingers on the planchette with the rest of us. Zach, being Zach, goes full drama mode and starts asking these cheesy questions in a fake serious voice. "Is there anyone here with us? Reveal yourself." We're all snickering, not taking it seriously at all. Then, nothing happens for a good minute. Just awkward silence, the flickering light, and Zach looking disappointed. Chris starts mocking the whole thing. "Oh no, the ghosts don't want to come out and play." And I swear, just as he said that, the planchette moved. I thought it was Zach or Chris trying to mess with us. But it wasn't just a little twitch. It was a smooth, steady glide. Everyone went dead quiet, like the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. I remember laughing nervously and saying, "Okay, who's moving it?" Jess was already looking pale, her eyes darting from the board to each of us. "Stop messing around, guys," she whispered. But none of us fessed up. And that's when Zach asked, "Who are you?" We all kept our fingers on the planchette, and I could feel it vibrating under my fingertips as it slid across the board, spelling out a single word. C-A-L-L. We all stared at it, confused. "Call?" Chris muttered. Zach looked just as puzzled as the rest of us. "What does that even mean?" Jess's voice broke the silence, shaky and low. "Let's stop. This isn't funny anymore." But Zach, clearly not reading the room, ignored her and asked another question. "What do you want?" The planchette moved again, quicker this time. It spelled out Listen. At this point, I was done. Like, my heart was pounding, and this wasn't fun anymore. "All right, I'm out. This is getting weird," I said, pulling my hands away from the board. But Zach and Chris, nah, they kept going, determined to get answers or something. Chris, the skeptic, was clearly unnerved, but still clinging to the idea that someone was messing with us. "Jess, are you doing this?" he asked, his voice a mix of disbelief and nervous laughter. But she shook her head, her hands trembling as she kept them on the planchette. "Number, I swear I'm not." Then Zach, probably sensing the tension, cracked a joke. "What's the worst that could happen? The ghost's gonna slide into our DMS." But before anyone could laugh, the planchette jerked violently, like it was being yanked. We all jumped back, eyes wide. No one was laughing anymore. And then, from somewhere in the house, maybe upstairs, maybe outside, we heard a knock. Not a regular knock. It was slow, deliberate. 3 distinct knocks. We all froze. "Did you guys hear that?" Jess whispered, her voice barely audible. Zach nodded, looking up towards the ceiling like he was trying to pinpoint where the sound came from. "It's probably just the house creaking," he said, but even he didn't sound convinced. That's when the light flickered again. This time, longer. We were sitting in near darkness for what felt like a solid 10 seconds. And then the planchette, with no one touching it, moved again. It slid to the letters, spelling out O-P-E-N. I think the scariest thing about that night wasn't the Ouija board itself. It was that damn knock. I don't know what it is about hearing something when you shouldn't. When everything's still and quiet and suddenly there's a sound you can't explain. It hits you in a way that nothing else does. It's like your brain struggles to make sense of it, and for a split second, you try to convince yourself it was just the wind or an old house settling. But that knock? It was way too deliberate for that. 3 knocks, and the word open spelled out in front of us. At this point, Jess was already done. She stood up, backing away from the table, shaking her head. "I'm not staying here," she muttered, her voice shaky. I could tell she was trying to keep it together, but I could see the panic in her eyes. Honestly, I felt the same way, but Zach and Chris, man, they still weren't taking it seriously. Zach, grinning like an idiot, stood up and made this dramatic show of walking towards the basement door. "You guys are such babies," he said, laughing. "It's probably some raccoon or something. I'll go check it out." Now, let me explain something about Zach. The dude's always been fearless, borderline reckless, really. But in that moment, even he looked a little uneasy. He put on this act, but I could tell by the way he hesitated at the door that he wasn't so sure anymore. The rest of us stood there, dead quiet, waiting for him to open the door. The knocking had stopped, but the tension, that was still very much alive. The air felt heavy, like something was pressing down on us. I didn't realize it until later, but my hands were shaking. I mean, this wasn't fun anymore. We'd crossed a line. Zach gripped the doorknob, gave us one last smirk over his shoulder, and yanked the door open. And there was nothing. Just the darkness of the hallway leading up the stairs. No raccoon, no pranksters, no nothing. He stepped out into the hall, squinting as if he expected something to jump out at him. But again, there was only silence. Relieved, Zach turned back to us. "See? Told you guys. You're just freaking yourselves." And then it happened again. The knock. Except this time, it came from the basement door right behind him. Zach froze. His face went pale, and for a second I thought maybe I was hearing things. Maybe the stress of the whole night was playing tricks on us. But when I saw Jess's eyes go wide and Chris take a step back, I knew it wasn't just me. That knock came from behind the door that led to the storage room. A door none of us had touched all night. A door that was supposed to be locked. Zach turned around slowly, like he was in a bad dream. He reached for the handle, his hand shaking now. I locked this earlier," he muttered, mostly to himself. But before he could touch the handle, Jess practically screamed, "Don't!" We all jumped, and Zach pulled his hand back like the door was suddenly scorching hot. Jess, now standing with her back against the far wall, looked more scared than I'd ever seen her. "Zach, I'm serious. Don't open that door." None of us moved. Not for a good few seconds anyway. It was like we were all silently processing the fact that something, or someone, was on the other side of that door. Chris, who had been the biggest skeptic all night, finally broke the silence. Okay, this isn't funny anymore. What the hell is going on? But Zach, still determined to be the tough guy, scoffed and started toward the door again. It's probably just a draft or something. This place is old as hell. But deep down, we all knew that wasn't the case. The storage room. It was more like a glorified closet with no windows, and no way a draft could have caused a knock that deliberate. 3 knocks, each one as clear as day. Zach placed his hand on the doorknob again, and before Jess or any of us could stop him, he twisted it. I swear, as soon as he cracked that door open, the temperature in the basement dropped by at least 10 degrees. I could see my breath in front of me, and that's when I knew this wasn't a joke. This wasn't some prank Zach had cooked up to freak us out. Something was wrong. Seriously wrong. The door creaked open, revealing nothing but darkness inside. Zach hesitated, his face completely blank now, as if he was realizing, too late, that he shouldn't have done this. For a moment, nothing happened. The darkness inside that storage room just stared back at us, cold and empty. But then, we heard it. A voice. No, not a voice. More like a whisper. Faint, barely audible, but there. It was so soft it could have been mistaken for the wind, if it weren't for the fact that it was saying something. The whisper was coming from inside the room. Zach stepped back, his face going pale. I'd never seen him look scared like that. Did you hear that? He whispered, almost as if he was afraid to say it out loud. We all nodded. None of us dared to speak. The whispering grew louder, like it was coming closer. Closer. And then the door slammed shut. Hard, like someone had kicked it. The noise echoed through the basement and Jess screamed. I'll admit, I flinched too, because that sound, it was too aggressive, too final. Zach stumbled back from the door, his eyes wide in disbelief. I locked it. I swear I locked it. But that didn't matter anymore. Something, someone, was in there now. The Ouija board was still sitting on the table, completely untouched since the last time the planchette had moved. But I glanced at it, and I swear the letters looked different. I can't explain it, but it was like the board had shifted on its own, even though none of us had gone near it. Chris, who had been uncharacteristically quiet for the past few minutes, finally broke the silence. We need to leave, he said, his voice shaky but firm. Now. And for once, no one argued, not even Zach. But just as we turned to leave, the lights in the basement went out. Total darkness, and that whisper. It was right behind me. There's something about being plunged into total darkness that messes with your head. 1 second, you can see your surroundings, you know where your friends are, and everything feels, at least somewhat, under control. But when the lights went out, everything changed. It wasn't just dark, it was heavy. The air felt thick, like I was suddenly breathing through a wet cloth. And that whisper? It was so close, like someone was right behind me, their breath on the back of my neck. But when I spun around, there was no one, just the cold, empty basement and my friends standing as still as statues. No one spoke for a moment, like we were all waiting for something else to happen. I was holding my breath, and I swear, the darkness seemed to stretch on forever. It's weird how time works when you're scared out of your mind. It felt like we were stuck in that pitch-black basement for hours, but it was probably just seconds. Then Zach, the fearless idiot who started this whole mess, broke the silence. All right, we need to get out of here. His voice was low, shaky, completely different from his usual cocky tone. I couldn't see his face, but I could hear the panic in his voice, and that alone was enough to tell me how real this was. We fumbled around for our phones, using the flashlight apps to cut through the darkness. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. I kept expecting to see something lurking in the shadows, something that didn't belong. But every time I looked, there was nothing there. Still, that whisper stayed with us. Soft, like it was echoing around the basement. But there was no echo, just that voice circling us like it was looking for a way in. I couldn't make out what it was saying, but it sounded like laughter. No, not laughter. Mocking. Whatever it was, it didn't sound friendly. Chris was the first one to move. "Come on," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. He led the way, shining his phone light towards the stairs. I was right behind him, Jess clinging to my arm like her life depended on it. Zach, for once, wasn't trying to be the hero. He stayed close behind, his flashlight bouncing erratically as he moved. We made it halfway to the stairs when something made me stop. It was a smell, faint at first, but growing stronger with every step we took. It was this sickly sweet metallic stench, like old rusted metal mixed with decaying flowers. I gagged and covered my nose, glancing at the others to see if they smelled it too. Jess stopped in her tracks, pulling me back. "Do you smell that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. I nodded, but I didn't want to say it out loud. Something about acknowledging it felt wrong, like it would make whatever was causing the smell real. Chris, who had been leading the way, paused too. He didn't say anything, but I saw him glance over his shoulder, his face pale in the dim light. Zach, bringing up the rear, swore under his breath. "What the hell is that?" No one answered. We didn't want to know. Then, without warning, something cold brushed past my arm, like ice. I jumped, nearly dropping my phone, and whipped around, shining my flashlight in every direction. Nothing, just empty air. But that whisper? It was closer now, right behind us. And this time, it wasn't just a sound. It laughed. I can't explain how wrong it felt to hear that laugh. It was low, guttural, and completely unnatural, like someone or something was mocking us. I could feel the vibration of it in my bones. Whatever was down here with us, it wasn't playing around anymore. "Run!" Jess screamed suddenly, yanking me towards the stairs. And we did. We bolted, our footsteps echoing in the basement as we sprinted for the stairs. My heart was pounding in my ears and my legs felt like jelly, but I didn't stop. I didn't dare look back. Chris hit the stairs first, practically leaping up them two at a time. I was right behind him, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Jess was still clinging to my arm, her grip tight enough to hurt, and I could hear Zach's heavy footsteps just behind us. We made it to the top of the stairs, bursting through the basement door and slamming it shut behind us. For a second, everything went quiet. We stood there, catching our breath, hearts racing, while the rest of Zach's house was eerily silent. The whispering stopped. No more laughter, no more knocks, just silence. For a brief moment, I actually thought we were safe, that maybe we'd imagined everything. The rational part of my brain was already trying to convince me that it was just stress, just our imaginations running wild in the dark. But then Zach's phone buzzed. We all jumped, nerves still on edge, and Zach fumbled for his phone. His face went white as he looked at the screen. Guys?" he muttered, his voice shaky. "I just got a message." I stared at him, confused. "A message? From who?" He looked up at us, his hands trembling as he turned the phone around to show us, and my blood ran cold. The message wasn't from a number we recognized. In fact, it wasn't from a number at all. It was just a blank sender. But the message was clear. It said, in all caps, "Come back." We all stared at the phone in disbelief. Zach started pacing, running his hands through his hair like he was trying to figure out what to do. "This isn't possible," he kept muttering. "There's no way." But Chris, for the first time that night, was dead serious. "Delete it. Right now." Zach didn't argue. He swiped to delete the message, but the second he did, His phone buzzed again. The same message. Come back. He swiped again, deleting it, but it kept coming, over and over. Come back. Come back. Jess started crying. Quiet, terrified sobs. I was shaking too, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from that screen. I felt like if I looked away, something would grab me, pull me back down into the basement. Zach threw his phone onto the table like somehow that would make it stop. But even from across the room, we could see the screen light up, vibrating relentlessly as the message kept coming through. "Shut it off," I whispered, my voice barely working. "Just turn it off." Zach grabbed the phone, his hands still shaking, and held the power button down until the screen went black. Finally, the buzzing stopped. The room was silent again, except for the sound of Jess's quiet sobbing. But then, from the basement door, there was a click. The sound of a lock sliding open. We all turned towards the door, holding our breath. And from behind the door, we heard that whisper again. Come back. You know that feeling when you leave a place, but something feels off. Like you didn't really escape, like something's still clinging to you. That's what it felt like after we left Zach's house that night. I thought that once we got out of there, things would settle down. Maybe we could laugh about it in a few days, call it a bad night, and move on. But I couldn't have been more wrong. We all went home separately, and none of us talked much on the way out. Zach didn't even try to crack one of his usual jokes. Jess was still sniffling, her eyes red from crying, and Chris, who's normally the most level-headed guy I know, didn't say a word. We just needed to get away from that house, from that basement, from that whisper that wouldn't leave us alone. When I got back to my place, everything seemed normal enough. My parents were already asleep. The house was dark and quiet, and for the first time in hours, I felt like maybe we were in the clear. I took a long, hot shower, trying to shake off the cold that had settled into my bones. I didn't even want to think about what had happened. It was just a game. I kept telling myself that. Just a stupid game that had gotten out of hand. I crawled into bed, turned off my phone, and stared at the ceiling, trying to force my brain to shut off. But even in the quiet, in the dark of my own room, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me. It was like that basement had followed me. Like the air in my room felt just as heavy and suffocating. I could almost hear that whisper still, just faint enough to make me question if it was real. I didn't sleep much that night. The next day, I woke up to a series of texts in the group chat from Chris. Chris, yo, anyone else feel weird today? Chris, I can't stop hearing that whisper. I thought I was just being paranoid last night, but this morning too. Jess, I heard it too. I barely slept. I kept checking my windows. I don't know why. It's like I could feel something outside. Zach, all right, let's all calm down. It's probably just our nerves. We got spooked. It happens. Just a bad night. Chris wasn't having it. Chris, dude, this isn't just nerves. Something's wrong. I went outside this morning, and I swear I saw something out of the corner of my eye. Like, I don't know, a shadow. But when I turned to look, it was gone. My stomach dropped when I read that, because the same thing had happened to me. I hadn't mentioned it in the chat yet, but earlier that morning, when I was brushing my teeth, I saw a flicker of movement in the mirror. Just for a second. It was in the hallway behind me. I turned around, thinking it was my dad, or maybe the cat, but the hall was empty. I thought I was imagining it, just my mind playing tricks on me. But now, reading Chris's message, I wasn't so sure anymore. That's when Jess sent another message. This one was different. Jess, guys, I just checked my phone. There's a missed call from an unknown number. The timestamp is 3:03 a.m., but my phone was on silent. 3:03 a.m. Exactly the time we had been using the Ouija board the night before. Suddenly, my phone didn't feel so safe anymore. I picked it up, my hands trembling a bit as I unlocked it. I wasn't sure what I was looking for. Maybe some kind of reassurance that it was all in our heads. But when I went to my recent call history, there it was. A missed call. Unknown number. 3:03 a.m. My heart skipped a beat, and for a second I just stared at the screen, my mind blank. I hadn't heard my phone ring. No buzzing. Nothing. I didn't even have a voicemail. I felt sick. I texted the group chat, telling them about the call. Zach, still in denial, tried to brush it off again. Zach, look, this is freaky. Yeah, but let's not lose our heads. It's just a weird coincidence. Phones glitch all the time. But deep down, I think even he knew this wasn't just a glitch. Jess wasn't having any of it either. Jess, this isn't just a glitch. I checked my phone 1,000,000 times last night. How did I miss this? And the whisper. I heard it all night. It wasn't just in my head. I kept hearing it right outside my bedroom door. And that's when Chris sent the message that made everything worse. Chris, I don't think it's just the phone calls. Last night, after I went to bed, I heard knocking. I froze. I hadn't told anyone about what I'd heard before falling asleep. The same knock we heard at Zach's house. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. It had happened just after I turned off the lights, but I convinced myself it was the house settling. That's what I wanted to believe. But now Chris was saying he heard it too. Chris, 3 knocks, just like in the basement. And when I opened the door to check, no one was there. Zach finally caved. Zach, okay, yeah, this is getting weird. I heard the knocks too, just one set. Thought I was dreaming or something, but it woke me up. Didn't want to freak myself out, so I didn't check the door. We were all spiraling now. The Ouija board hadn't just stayed at Zach's house. It had come with us. Whatever we'd contacted that night was still with us, still watching us. And then, Jess sent the message that made my blood run cold. Jess, I can't do this anymore. I just checked the mirror in my bathroom. There's something written on it. Come back. I stared at my phone, my hands shaking, barely able to process what I was reading. Come back. The same message that Zach had been getting on his phone. It had followed Jess home too. Chris called for an emergency meetup at a nearby diner, just so we could talk in person. I think we all needed to get out of our houses, to be around other people. Safety in numbers, or at least the illusion of it. When we met up, it was clear we were all on edge. Jess kept glancing over her shoulder like she expected something to be lurking behind her. Chris hadn't slept at all. He looked pale, like he was running on pure adrenaline. And Zach, even he looked scared now. His usual bravado was gone, replaced with this hollow, haunted look in his eyes. We sat in a booth in the back, away from the other customers. None of us ordered anything. We just needed to talk, to figure out what the hell was happening to us. That Ouija board, Chris began, but he couldn't even finish the sentence. We all knew what he was getting at. It wasn't just a game. We had contacted something that wasn't going to leave us alone. We have to destroy it, Jess whispered, her voice barely audible. The board, we have to get rid of it. Zach nodded slowly. Yeah, maybe that'll work. But how? It's still at my house. Before anyone could answer, Chris's phone buzzed on the table, making all of us jump. He picked it up, his face going pale. He turned the screen toward us. It was another message from an unknown number. It read, "You can't run." Sitting in that diner, staring at Chris's phone, I realized we were in way over our heads. The message, "You can't run," wasn't just some random glitch. Whatever we'd summoned wasn't tied to the Ouija board anymore. It had attached itself to us, and it wasn't going to let go, not until it got what it wanted. Zach, the one who had always played things cool, looked like he was on the verge of losing it. "What the hell does that even mean?" he muttered, rubbing his face with both hands. "Are we just supposed to sit here and wait for it to, what? Kill us?" Jess shook her head violently, tears welling up in her eyes again. number. We have to do something. We need to get rid of the board, burn it or bury it or something. It's the only way. Chris, who had been staring at his phone with wide eyes, finally snapped out of his trance. All right, let's do it. We'll go back to Zach's, grab the board and burn it. That has to work, right? At that point, we were desperate enough to try anything. So we left the diner and piled into Zach's car, driving in near silence back to his house. The sun had already set, and the streets were empty, as if the whole world was trying to avoid what we were about to face. The closer we got to Zach's place, the heavier the air seemed to get. That same suffocating feeling we'd experienced in his basement. It was like the darkness itself was pressing down on us, making it harder to breathe. When we pulled into Zach's driveway, no one moved. For a good minute, we just sat there, staring at the house. It looked normal enough. Just a regular suburban home with a perfectly mowed lawn and a porch light flickering on and off. But to us, it had become something else. It was the place where all of this had started. And I think deep down, we knew going back inside meant facing whatever was waiting for us. Zach took a deep breath and unbuckled his seatbelt. All right, let's get this over with. We followed him up the steps, our footsteps unnaturally loud in the eerie quiet of the neighborhood. Zach unlocked the front door, and the four of us stepped inside. The house was dark, just like before. No lights, no noise, just that heavy, oppressive silence. Every creak of the floorboards felt amplified, like the house was holding its breath. We made our way down to the basement, flashlights in hand. The further we descended, the colder it got. It was that bone-chilling cold that settles deep into your muscles, making it impossible to shake off. As we stepped into the basement, it felt like walking into a different world. The room was exactly as we'd left it. Ouija board still on the table, the planchette resting in the center, like it had just been waiting for us to come back. Jess was the first to speak. Let's burn it and get the hell out of here. Zach nodded and grabbed a lighter from his pocket. He stepped towards the board, and just as he was about to flick the flame, we all heard it again. The whisper. It was louder this time, more distinct, but still coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. It wasn't mocking anymore. It was angry, and I swear, the temperature in the room dropped another 10 degrees. We all froze, staring at the board. The planchette started to move, slowly at first, then faster, as if something invisible was dragging it across the letters. None of us were touching it, but it moved with purpose. It spelled out D-O-N-T. Jess took a step back. Number, no, we need to burn it. Now. But Zach just stood there, staring at the board, the lighter still in his hand. It's telling us not to, he whispered, almost like he was in a trance. Chris grabbed Zach by the arm. Screw what it says. We're ending this now. But before Zach could light the board, the basement door slammed shut, echoing through the room like a gunshot. We all jumped, turning toward the door, but no one was there. Just that whisper, growing louder and louder, swirling around us like a storm. And then the knocking started. 3 slow, deliberate knocks from behind the basement door, just like before. The same damn pattern. My stomach twisted into knots, and Jess let out a quiet sob, backing into the corner of the room. Burn it, I shouted. Do it now. Zach flicked the lighter, and for a second, the flame illuminated his face. He stepped forward, holding the flame to the edge of the board. The wood started to blacken, smoke curling up from the surface, and for a split second, I thought we were going to be okay. But then, just as the fire began to catch, the lights in the basement flickered back on. Every bulb in the ceiling buzzed to life, casting an unnatural, blinding light over the room. And in that moment, I saw something. I'll never forget it. Standing in the far corner of the basement, just beyond the table, was a figure. Tall, thin, its body twisted and contorted, like it didn't belong in this world. Its face, if you could call it a face, was shrouded in shadow. But I could see the hollow pits where its eyes should have been, staring straight at us. Its mouth, wide and gaping, was twisted into an impossible grin. The whisper wasn't a whisper anymore. It was a voice. "You can't run," it hissed. Zach stumbled back, dropping the lighter, and the flame went out. The fire on the board smouldered, but it wasn't enough to destroy it. The planchette started moving again, this time faster, erratically, spelling out nonsense as if whatever we'd summoned was in a frenzy. We were frozen, paralyzed by fear. Chris was the first to break the spell. He grabbed the board, yanked it off the table, and threw it onto the concrete floor. "We need to burn this thing," he shouted, kicking the planchette across the room. But the figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching us, that grin never faltering. Jess was sobbing now, clutching her knees to her chest, and I could barely breathe. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to run, to get out of there. But the door was closed, and we all knew what waited on the other side. The knocking came again, louder this time, more insistent. Chris grabbed Zach's lighter and tried again, setting the edge of the board on fire. This time, the flames spread faster, licking across the wood until it was fully engulfed. The figure in the corner didn't flinch, but as the board burned, the air in the basement grew colder, so cold that my breath came out in visible puffs, freezing in the air. For a moment, nothing happened. The board crackled and burned, and the whispering finally started to fade. But then the lights went out again, pitch black. I couldn't see anything, couldn't hear anything, except for my own breathing. And then, in the darkness, I felt something. Cold, bony fingers brushing against the back of my neck. I screamed. The lights flickered back on, and the figure was gone. The basement door creaked open, and for the first time in hours, the air felt lighter. The board had burned down to ash, and the planchette lay broken on the floor. Whatever it was gone. We didn't say a word as we left Zach's house that night. None of us wanted to admit what had just happened. We didn't want to believe it, but we all felt it. Something had been in that basement with us, something that still lingered, even after the board was gone. It's been a few weeks since then, and none of us have talked about it since. Zach moved out of that house. Jess refuses to touch her phone after 3 a.m, and Chris has been seeing a therapist to help him deal with the nightmares. As for me, sometimes, late at night, I still hear it. That whisper. Faint, just on the edge of my hearing, like it's waiting. I try to ignore it, but every once in a while, I catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. Something tall, twisted, watching, waiting. The Ouija board said to open the window. Now something is inside. It started like one of those nights where nothing's going on, you know? Just a typical Wednesday night. No plans, no parties, not even a decent show to binge. I was sitting on my couch, scrolling through Reddit for like the 100th time, and I guess boredom makes you do weird things. I got a text from my buddy Nate. We've been friends since high school, and he's always down for some dumb late-night shenanigans. You know the type. If there's a bad idea, he'll make it worse just for the hell of it. This time, though, it wasn't his usual, "Let's sneak into an abandoned house," or "Let's see how much Taco Bell we can eat in one sitting" text. No, this was different. "Yo, wanna try the Ouija board again?" Now, this wasn't the first time we'd messed with a Ouija board. The last time we tried it, nothing really happened, except for a lot of bad jokes and Nate trying to move the planchette to spell out dirty words. I'm not exactly the superstitious type, but there's something about the board that's always creeped me out, even if I never really admitted it. So I hesitated. But then, out of boredom, and maybe a tiny bit of wanting to prove I wasn't a chicken, I replied, "Sure, come over. He showed up in like 20 minutes, the board tucked under his arm, and a mischievous grin plastered on his face. We set up on the coffee table in my living room. Just me, Nate, and this dusty old Ouija board that looked like it had been through more crap than we had in high school. Now, before I go any further, I should say, I'm not into the whole supernatural thing. I've watched enough horror movies to know nothing good comes from messing with these things, but I always figured that was just Hollywood exaggeration. Plus, Nate was all into it, and I didn't want to be the buzzkill. We started slow, asking the usual questions like, "Is anyone there?" and "What's your name?" The planchette would barely move, just the occasional twitch. Nate kept cracking jokes, trying to keep things light. I was kinda relieved, to be honest. Nothing was happening, just like the last time. But then, out of nowhere, the planchette shot across the board, like someone had yanked it. It landed on yes. I looked at Nate. "Dude, stop messing with it." "I'm not," he said, his voice suddenly serious. "I swear." That was the first moment I felt off, like maybe this wasn't just a game. I laughed it off though. "Yeah, okay, sure. Let's keep going," Nate said, eyes locked on the board. For a guy who usually couldn't take anything seriously, he looked focused. We asked the usual next question. "What's your name?" The planchette moved slowly this time, gliding over the letters. M-A-R-K. "Mark?" "That's not scary," Nate said, but I noticed he didn't laugh this time. Neither did I. "All right, Mark," I said, trying to sound casual. "What do you want?" There was a pause, a long one. And then, without warning, the planchette flew again, landing on one word that sent a cold shiver down my spine. "Oh, but E-N, open." I looked at Nate. "What the hell does that mean?" "Ask it what?" he said, his voice low, like he didn't really want to know. I swallowed hard. "What do you want us to open?" And that's when it spelled it out. W-I-N-D-O. W. "Open the window." I glanced over at the large window in my living room, the one that faces the street. The blinds were drawn, but I could still see the faint outline of the glass, and suddenly, I didn't like the idea of that window being in my house at all. It felt like something was watching us. Nate, of course, laughed it off. "Dude, the ghost wants some fresh air. Let's open the damn window." "Don't," I said, maybe a little too quickly. Nate paused, looking at me like I'd lost it. "You're not seriously freaked out, are you?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. "Come on, man. It's just a game." But it didn't feel like a game anymore. Something was off. The air in the room felt heavy, like the space around us had shrunk. I couldn't explain it, but I didn't want that window open. The idea of it made my skin crawl. Still, Nate being Nate, he got up and made a show of walking over to the window, his hands raised like he was about to pull the blinds open. "Don't," I said again, my voice firmer this time. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the cord. That's when we heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible tapping. Not on the door, not on the floorboards, but on the window itself. Tap, tap, tap. I swear, in that moment, everything went still. Nate froze, his eyes wide, his face pale. I could feel my heart hammering in my chest as that rhythmic tapping continued, almost impatient. "Nate," I whispered, "don't open the window." For the first time that night, I saw genuine fear flash across his face. He backed away slowly, moving back toward the coffee table. The Ouija board sat there, perfectly still, but it felt like it was watching us. We didn't touch the board again. We didn't say another word. Just sat there, both of us staring at the window like something, or someone, was right on the other side of it, waiting for us to let it in. And the tapping didn't stop. We sat there for what felt like forever, just staring at the window. The tapping hadn't stopped. It was like it knew we were too scared to move. Nate had backed off, hands in his pockets, pacing the room like he was trying to figure out whether to laugh or freak out. I could tell he wasn't as chill as he wanted to seem, though. Not this time. "Maybe it's just the wind," he muttered, but even he didn't sound convinced. There was no breeze tonight. In fact, everything outside was dead silent. No cars, no crickets, nothing. The tapping wasn't random either. It had a rhythm to it. 3 taps. Pause. 3 taps again, like a pattern, like someone, or something, was trying to get our attention. I tried to break the tension with a laugh. "Yeah, right, the wind's knocking politely to be let in." Nate didn't respond, and that scared me more than the tapping itself. I decided we needed to end this. I'm not sure why I thought this would help, but I grabbed the Ouija board and slid the planchette back to the middle. "We're done, okay?" I said aloud. "Goodbye." Nothing happened. The board didn't move, the tapping didn't stop, and that weird, heavy feeling still hung in the air. It was like whatever we'd contacted didn't care that we were done playing. I looked over at Nate, and for the first time, he seemed genuinely shaken. His usual cocky grin was gone, replaced with a kind of hollow fear. "Let's just close the board and call it a night," I suggested. I was trying to sound calm, but my voice came out shaky. Nate nodded, quickly flipping the board over and tossing it aside like it was nothing. But the second he did that, the tapping on the window stopped. At first, I felt relieved, like maybe that was it. Maybe we'd somehow annoyed whatever was on the other side, and it had finally given up. But the relief lasted about 5 seconds, because then something else started. A soft, scraping sound. Not from the window this time, from inside the house. We both froze. The noise was faint but steady, like someone was dragging their fingernails along the walls. The sound crept along the room, moving closer. Slowly. "What the hell is that?" Nate whispered, his voice barely audible. I didn't answer because I didn't know. I didn't want to know. The scraping continued, crawling up the walls, circling us like it was trying to find a way in. I scanned the room, my heart pounding in my ears, but I couldn't see anything. The shadows seemed deeper than before, like they were hiding something just out of sight. My throat tightened. "Nate, man, we need to leave. Now." He didn't argue. He just nodded, eyes darting around the room like he expected something to jump out at any second. We both stood up slowly, like we were afraid that if we moved too quickly, whatever was making that sound would notice. I grabbed my keys from the coffee table, but as soon as I touched them, the lights flickered. Once, twice. Then they went out. The darkness hit us like a wave. Pure black, the kind where you can't even see your hand in front of your face. I felt Nate grab my arm in the dark, and for a split second, I was grateful I wasn't alone. Then, from the other side of the room, near the window, I heard it. A soft, raspy voice, barely more than a whisper. "Open the window." My stomach dropped. There was no way I heard that. I was just imagining it, right? But Nate heard it too. I felt his grip tighten on my arm. "Dude, we need to go," he whispered, his voice trembling. We fumbled around in the dark, trying to find our way to the front door. I was shaking so bad, I almost dropped my keys. But as soon as I reached for the doorknob, the scraping noise started again. Only this time, it wasn't just a sound. It was closer. I could feel something in the room with us, watching, waiting. "Nate, we have to..." I didn't get to finish my sentence. Before I could even turn the doorknob, the scraping stopped, and something hit the door, hard, like a body slamming against it from the other side. The whole door shook in its frame. I stumbled back, yanking Nate with me as the banging continued. Whatever was out there, or in here, was trying to get in, or get out. I wasn't sure which anymore. "Back door!" Nate hissed, dragging me toward the kitchen. We bolted through the house, tripping over furniture, not caring about the noise we made. When we reached the kitchen, I fumbled for the back door, hands shaking so bad I almost dropped the keys. My fingers finally found the lock, and I yanked the door open. We sprinted out into the backyard, the cool night air hitting my face like a slap. But we didn't stop running. Not until we were far away from the house, standing in the middle of the empty street, gasping for breath. What the hell was that? Nate panted, his hands on his knees. I couldn't answer him. I didn't have an answer. We stood there in the dark, trying to catch our breath, and I turned to look back at the house. All the lights were off. The blinds on the living room window were still drawn, but for the first time that night, I felt like we weren't being watched. Like maybe, whatever it was, had stayed inside. And then the blinds moved. Just a little. Just enough for me to catch a glimpse of something. A shadow. Something tall and thin, standing just behind the glass. Its hand pressed up against the window, fingers long and bony, scraping against the glass. It wasn't trying to get out. It was already inside. We stood in the middle of the street, just staring at my house. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it might explode. Nate was next to me, hands on his head, breathing like he'd just run a marathon. Neither of us said a word for what felt like forever. I couldn't take my eyes off the window. That thing, I don't know what else to call it, was still there, standing behind the blinds, its long fingers pressed against the glass like it was waiting for us to come back. It hadn't moved. It was just watching. What do we do? Nate finally whispered, his voice barely audible. He sounded terrified. And Nate doesn't scare easily. I didn't know. My mind was racing, trying to come up with some logical explanation, but nothing made sense. It felt like we were caught in one of those bad dreams where you're running from something but never fast enough. The kind where you wake up sweating and swearing you heard footsteps behind you. Except this wasn't a dream. We can't go back inside, I said, more to myself than to him. We can't. Nate nodded, still catching his breath. Let's just get out of here, man. Screw your house. I couldn't argue with that. But as we turned to walk down the street, I realized something. My phone, my wallet, my entire life was back inside that house. But none of that mattered because I'd left the door wide open when we ran out. I don't know why, but that thought hit me like a ton of bricks. I couldn't shake the image of the front door just hanging open, an invitation for whatever was inside to leave. And worse, I couldn't stop thinking about what would happen if it did leave. We need to close the door, I muttered, feeling sick to my stomach. I hated the idea. It was probably the stupidest thing I could have suggested, but some primal part of my brain was screaming that leaving it open was a mistake. Like the moment we turned our backs on it, things would get worse. A lot worse. Nate stared at me like I'd lost my mind. You want to go back? After that? I shook my head. I don't want to, but I don't think we have a choice. He looked back at the house, then at me. This is insane. You know that, right? Yeah, I admitted. But leaving it open feels wrong. He let out a long, shaky breath, glancing over his shoulder like he was expecting someone, or something, to be standing right behind us. All right, man. Let's do this quick. We walked back toward the house. Every step felt like I was getting closer to the edge of some cliff, and any second I'd fall off. The closer we got, the heavier the air seemed, like something was pushing down on us, making it hard to breathe. The front door was still wide open, just like I'd left it. The inside of the house was pitch black, but I swear I could feel something waiting in there, watching us. I glanced back at the window. The blinds were still drawn, but that shadow, that thing, wasn't behind them anymore. That realization sent a cold wave of panic through me. If it wasn't at the window, where was it? Hurry up, Nate urged, glancing around nervously. He was shifting from foot to foot like he wanted to bolt at any second. I nodded, steeling myself. I reached out slowly, fingers trembling, and grabbed the edge of the door. It felt colder than it should have been, like the wood itself was ice. With a quick motion, I slammed it shut. The second the door closed, something shifted. The air felt lighter, almost like the house had exhaled. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding, stepping back from the door. "Okay, we're done," Nate said, already turning to walk away. "Let's get out of here before something else happens." I was about to agree when I noticed something strange. The silence. I mean, the street was dead quiet. No traffic, no wind, nothing. Just this thick, suffocating silence that seemed unnatural, like we were the only two people left in the world. Then, from behind us, inside the house, there was a sound. Faint at first, but unmistakable. Footsteps. I froze. So did Nate. We both stood there, staring at the front door, listening as the footsteps grew louder. They weren't hurried or erratic. They were slow, steady, deliberate. Nate whispered, "Dude, is that..." I nodded, my throat dry. There was no one else in the house, just us and whatever we'd let in. Suddenly the footsteps stopped, right behind the front door. My heart was racing so fast it felt like it was about to explode. We stood there, too afraid to move, to breathe, waiting for whatever was on the other side to make its next move. Then came the sound of a doorknob turning, slowly, methodically. The front door, the one I'd just closed, was now being opened from the inside. "Run!" I shouted, and without thinking, we both bolted. I didn't care where we were going, just as long as it was away from the house. My legs felt like they were made of lead, but adrenaline pushed me forward. I didn't look back. I couldn't. But I could hear it. The door creaking open behind us, the footsteps starting again. This time, they were faster, louder, following us. We didn't stop until we reached the end of the street. My lungs burned, and I could barely breathe, but we were far enough away that I felt like we could finally stop. I glanced back at the house, and for a moment, everything seemed still. The front door was closed again, and the windows looked normal, like nothing had ever happened. It almost felt like a sick joke, like we'd imagined the whole thing. But I knew better. I could still feel it. That presence. Something had crossed a line when we touched that board, and now it was inside. Not just the house, but here, with us. "Where is it?" Nate asked, panting beside me. I didn't answer. I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that whatever had been behind the window was now out, and it was moving. I pulled out my phone, hands still shaking, and dialed for an Uber. Nate looked at me, eyes wide. "Where are we going?" "Anywhere but here," I said, my voice shaky. "I'm not staying in that house." He didn't argue. Neither of us could. We just stood there in the darkness, waiting, knowing that something, someone, was still inside, watching us. And that's when I felt it. A shift in the air, like the darkness wasn't just around us, but pressing closer. The silence had weight. I turned to Nate, but before I could say anything, I saw it. In the window of the house. It was back, but this time it wasn't alone. We stood frozen on the sidewalk, both of us staring at the window of my house. It was back, the shadow, tall, thin, still as a statue, and this time, it wasn't alone. Behind it, barely visible in the dark, were more figures. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. I squinted, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but no, there were definitely more of them. Dark silhouettes, just like the first one, but they were all pressed up against the glass now, crowding behind the blinds like they were waiting for something. Their faces, or what should have been their faces, were just empty, featureless voids. No eyes, no mouths, just shadows in the shape of people, watching us. "What the hell?" Nate whispered, taking a step back. His voice cracked, and I could hear the panic creeping in. I didn't respond. I couldn't. My throat had gone completely dry and my mind was racing, trying to process what was happening. There were at least 3, maybe 4 of them, and they were all staring out from my window like they were waiting for an invitation, like they wanted to come out. That's when I heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. This time, it wasn't coming from the window. It was coming from the front door, the one we'd just closed and run from. I turned to look at Nate, my heart pounding in my chest. "Did you hear that?" He nodded, his face pale. "Yeah, man, I heard it." The tapping continued, slow and deliberate, like someone or something was testing the door. My gut twisted. There was no way I was going back to that house. I didn't care what was left behind. Not my phone, not my wallet. Nothing was worth facing whatever was inside now. "Nate, we need to get out of here," I said, my voice shaky. But just as I said that, the front door creaked open. Slowly. We hadn't touched it, hadn't gone near it, but there it was, swinging open on its own, like it was beckoning us back inside. My breath caught in my throat. The house seemed to breathe with the door, like something was pulling us closer, inviting us to step back into the darkness. I could feel it, the same heaviness in the air, the same suffocating silence that had been inside earlier. Whatever was in there, it wanted us back. And then I saw something that nearly made me collapse right there on the street. One of the figures in the window moved. It stepped forward, its body shifting unnaturally, almost like it was gliding. It didn't open the blinds or smash through the glass. It just moved, right through the window, like it didn't need permission to enter anymore. It was coming out whether we liked it or not. I grabbed Nate's arm. "Go, now." We bolted down the street, not daring to look back. My legs felt like they were made of lead, but adrenaline was pushing me forward. We didn't stop running until we reached the end of the block, where the streetlight flickered weakly overhead. Panting, we both doubled over, trying to catch our breath. I dared to glance back at my house, half expecting to see the figures following us. But the street was empty. The house looked dark and still again, as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. I knew what was inside, waiting, watching. "I'm not going back there," Nate gasped, hands on his knees, his face drenched in sweat. "I don't care what we left. I'm never going back in that house, man." I nodded, too winded to speak. I didn't want to go back either. There was something unnatural about that place now, something wrong. It wasn't just a haunted house or some bad energy. We'd brought something in, and now it wasn't leaving. We stood there for a few minutes, just staring at the house from a distance. The Uber I'd called earlier still hadn't shown up, and I was starting to wonder if it ever would. The street felt isolated, cut off from the rest of the world, like we'd stepped into some forgotten pocket of reality where nothing made sense anymore. And then, as if to prove my point, I heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. But this time, it wasn't coming from the house. It was coming from behind us. I turned around slowly, my stomach churning with dread. The street behind us was dark, except for the weak, flickering streetlight. There was no one there. No one except a figure, standing in the shadows just beyond the reach of the light. It was one of them. The tall, thin shape, featureless and black, standing perfectly still, just watching us. It was standing under a tree, its body blending into the darkness, but I could see it clearly now. No eyes, no mouth, just a hollow, empty silhouette. And it wasn't alone. There were more of them. I could see them now, emerging from the shadows, stepping out from behind trees and parked cars. They weren't moving fast, but they were coming, slowly, deliberately, surrounding us. I could feel my pulse in my ears, my heart hammering against my chest. "Nate," I whispered, but my voice barely came out. He saw them too. His eyes widened, and without a word, he grabbed my arm and yanked me forward. "Run!" We sprinted again, heading toward the main road, trying to get as far away from those things as possible. My legs were burning and my lungs felt like they were on fire, but we didn't stop. We couldn't. I glanced over my shoulder and my blood ran cold. They were still there, following us. No matter how fast we ran, no matter how far we got, they stayed right behind us, just out of reach. Not running, just moving. Always closer. My phone buzzed in my pocket, but I didn't stop to check it. Not until we reached the main road where the streetlights were brighter and there were finally cars driving by. I fumbled for my phone, hands shaking, and saw the notification. Uber has arrived. I looked up, and sure enough, a car had pulled up at the curb a few yards ahead. Nate saw it too and pointed frantically. "There, let's go." We ran to the car and jumped in, slamming the doors behind us. The driver, an older guy with grey hair and a calm smile, turned to face us. "Rough night, huh?" I couldn't even respond. I was too out of breath. Nate just nodded, muttering, "Yeah, you could say that." As the car pulled away from the curb, I glanced out the window. The street behind us was empty again. No shadows, no figures, nothing. Just an ordinary suburban neighborhood. But I knew they were still there. Somewhere, waiting, watching. As the car drove us further and further from the house, I thought we might finally be safe. But then I noticed something that made my stomach drop all over again. The rearview mirror. The driver had hung a little charm from it, a tiny silver hand with long bony fingers. Fingers that looked exactly like the ones I'd seen pressed against my window. As the car sped down the main road, my heart was finally starting to slow down. I kept telling myself that we were safe now, that whatever had been in the house was behind us. I tried to believe it, but I couldn't stop staring at the charm hanging from the rearview mirror. It was small, just a cheap little trinket, but there was something about it. Those fingers, long, thin, unnaturally bony. They looked too much like the ones we'd seen pressed against the glass back at the house. I tried to shake it off, to tell myself I was just paranoid. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Next to me, Nate was slumped in the seat, staring out the window, still breathing hard. He hadn't noticed the charm yet. Maybe it was better that way. The driver seemed oblivious too, humming softly to himself as he navigated the empty streets. I forced myself to look away from the charm. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Maybe I was losing it after everything that had happened tonight. But then I glanced up at the rearview mirror again, and my blood ran cold. The reflection. In the back seat, right behind Nate and me, there was something. A shape. A shadow. I blinked, my heart pounding in my ears. For a moment, I thought I was imagining it. But no, it was there, sitting in the middle of the back seat, right between us. Tall, thin, featureless, one of them. It hadn't made a sound. It hadn't moved. It was just there, watching us through the reflection. "Nate," I whispered, my voice trembling. He didn't respond. He didn't even look at me. His eyes were fixed on the window, like he was too scared to move, too scared to even acknowledge that something was wrong. I wanted to scream, to jump out of the car, to do anything to get away from whatever was in the back seat with us. But I couldn't. My body was frozen, my mind racing. The air in the car felt thick, oppressive, like it was closing in on us. The driver glanced in the rearview mirror, catching my eyes for a split second. He smiled. "You boys look like you've seen a ghost." I couldn't tell if he was joking or not. His voice was calm, too calm, and that only made everything worse. I looked back at the reflection. The figure was still there, unmoving. But then I noticed something else. Its hand. It was resting on Nate's shoulder. Those long, bony fingers curled around him like it was claiming him. And Nate hadn't even noticed. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "Nate." Still no response. The car kept moving, the road stretching out ahead of us like some endless nightmare. I didn't know where we were going, but the further we drove, the darker everything seemed to get. The streetlights were fewer and farther between, the buildings and houses along the road fading into shadows. I had to do something. I couldn't just sit there and let this thing, whatever it was, take us. I forced myself to move, to lean over and grab Nate's arm. "Nate, listen to me, man. We need to get out of this car." He turned to look at me then, his face pale, eyes wide with fear. "What are you talking about?" I pointed at the rearview mirror, too afraid to turn around and look directly. "There's something in the back seat with us." His eyes flicked up to the mirror, and the moment he saw it, I could feel the air shift. His face went white, and his breath caught in his throat. "Oh my God!" Without thinking, he reached for the door handle, yanking it hard, but the door didn't budge. Locked. "Driver! Stop the car!" Nate shouted, banging on the window. But the driver didn't respond. He just kept humming, that same eerie tune, like he couldn't hear us at all. I tried my door too, but it was the same, locked tight. Panic surged through me. We were trapped in this car with it. "Please!" Nate was yelling now, pounding on the back of the driver's seat. "Let us out! Let us!" Suddenly, the car stopped. No warning, no screeching tires, just a dead stop in the middle of the road. The driver turned around in his seat slowly, his eyes locking on mine. His smile was gone now, replaced with something colder, something wrong. "You boys wanted to play with the unknown," he said, his voice low and calm. "Now you've let it in." I felt the blood drain from my face. He knew. He knew what we'd done with the Ouija board. He knew what we'd brought into my house. And now, somehow, he was a part of it. The figure in the back seat moved then. Slowly, deliberately. Its hand slid off Nate's shoulder, and I watched in horror as it leaned forward, its head tilting unnaturally, like it was studying us. I couldn't see its face. There was no face to see, but I could feel it. I could feel its eyes on me, feel the cold emptiness that radiated from it. "We have to get out," I whispered, barely able to speak. Nate nodded, his face drenched in sweat. We fumbled with the locks again, desperate, but nothing worked. The doors wouldn't open. The driver just sat there, watching us, his smile creeping back as if he was enjoying the show. Then, without warning, the figure in the back seat reached out, its long fingers wrapping around the back of my neck. The touch was ice cold, and it sent a jolt of terror through my entire body. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. It was like the air had been sucked out of the car. Nate was screaming, struggling to free himself, but the figure's other hand was on him now, pinning him in place. We were both trapped, suffocating under the weight of this thing, this presence that had followed us from the house, that had never really left. And then, just when I thought it was over, just when I thought I was about to black out, the driver spoke again. "Open the window." The words hit me like a slap. I looked at him, my mind reeling. The window. Why? But I didn't have time to question it. The hand around my neck tightened, and I knew I didn't have a choice. With trembling fingers, I reached for the window switch and pressed it. The glass slid down slowly, the cool night air rushing in. The moment the window was fully open, the figure in the back seat vanished. Just like that. Gone. The pressure lifted, and I gasped for breath, my body shaking. Nate did the same, slumping back in his seat, his face pale and sweaty. For a few moments, no one spoke. The car was filled with nothing but the sound of our heavy breathing. The driver turned back around, his eyes on the road, as if nothing had happened. "You should have never opened the door," he said quietly, almost to himself. "Once you let it in, it never really leaves." Without another word, he started driving again, the hum of the engine, the only sound in the car. Nate and I didn't speak. We couldn't. We just sat there, staring out the open window, terrified of what might come next. That was the last night I ever stepped foot in that house. We never went back for our stuff. I don't care if it's still sitting there. I don't care about anything I left behind. We're alive. That's all that matters. But every now and then, late at night, when I'm lying in bed, I hear it. Tap, tap, tap. And I know that it's still out there, waiting.